Good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joined us today, wherever you may be. I'm Anna Richards, Commercial Lead at Vitaccess, and I want to welcome you to the third webinar in the Vitaccess Keeping It Real series on rare disease registries. So speaking today, we have Dr. Mark Larkin, CEO and founder of Vitaccess, Dr. Casey Quinn, Chief Research Officer, and Dr. Catherine Bottomley, Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes. The topic today is co-creating rare disease registries, the journey from patient to insights in real-world evidence studies. So Mark will take you through a case study in My Real World MG, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. So feel free during the presentation to pop your questions in the question panel. As I said, the presentation will be based on My Real World MG study. This measures the impact of the rare condition myasthenia gravis on patients' daily lives. So this digital study is sponsored by Argenx and was co-created with patient advocacy groups and key opinion leaders from 9 countries. So I will pass over to Mark to start the presentation.
Fantastic, thanks a lot, Anna. So hopefully you can see my materials. Shout if you can't, co-presenters. But yeah, I'm going to try and move you through this really quickly, so really we can spend most of our time on the Q&A. So for those of us who don't know us, a quick intro to Vitaccess. We're a group of about 50 in our team, and we have these different groups within the team. So real-world evidence, analytics, localization, and consulting. And I mention those actually because for these types of studies that we do, all of those are involved at one time or another. So the ability to have a very nice platform to deliver the digital platform to deliver the studies, get the data out, is combined with these expert groups, analytics, consulting. And consulting is HUR, market access, patient-centered outcomes, and localization to be able to do studies in pretty much any language and country. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but broadly, we've built our own platform for digital platform for delivering these fast, inclusive, and global studies. We call it Vitaccess Real, and 2 parts. It's a device and operating system agnostic data capture platform, and then what we call a research portal with flexible dashboards to enable you to get the data and review the data in pretty much real time, which is nice. The typical types of engagement we have begins with patient advocacy group, key opinion leader onboarding, very collaborative. We'll talk more about that, through to study design, recruitment, the data capture, tiered launches, and then all the way through to publications right at the end. So typically we do publication plans that go along with the studies because they're very data rich. Casey and his team write a statistical analysis plan with typically interim final analyses. So there's lots of publication opportunities. But as you can see here, plenty of opportunities for interacting with different stakeholders, patient advocacy groups, key opinion leaders. It's not just in the design phase, it's all the way through the implementation as well. Just an idea of the platform really, which is about flexibility and designing using different parts for the design of different studies. So recruitment can be variable, site, community, you can get data from patients, caregivers, clinicians, and on the platform itself there's various different modules that we can bring to bear depending on the design of the study. You can read through those yourself, and then once we capture the data, we can get the data out very quickly through these real-time dashboards that you see on the right. So without further ado, I want to just take you through a case study really, that hopefully that'll bring that to life a little bit. This is a case study in myasthenia gravis, a rare disease, progressive disease, and it's what we think of as an adaptive patient registry. So it's global, as you'll see. Patients use a connected device to provide data about their circumstances and their condition. So this information is public, so you can look this up on clinicaltrials.gov. And actually, the public nature of the study is important for the co-creation. When approaching patient advocacy groups and key opinion leaders, they want the the governance framework to be appropriate so that it's transparent, and hopefully the data are going to be published. So you can see that on clinicaltrials.gov. Sponsors are argenx, Belgian biotech, also based in the US. The design, so it's a hybrid recruitment strategy. So some countries we have community, traditional vanilla community-based recruitment via these patient advocacy groups. Other countries, depending on the local ethics requirements, we've got a slightly different approach. It might involve clinicians a little bit more. So that's reflected also in a hybrid ethics strategy. So to take into consideration the requirements of the different countries. So IRB broadly, but in some cases there are exceptions, and there's local ethics approvals required. It's all electronic though, so 100% electronic informed consent, and we're heading towards 2,000 adults across the different countries that are in scope. So geography, it's global, US, Canada, North America, Japan, and across Europe, and the duration's 2 years. So if you look at the type of data we capture, and I'm going to try and go through this pretty quickly, but I'm sure you'll have questions about this. There's sort of 3 strands to that broadly. So there's profile and demographics, which most of that information comes from during enrollment. So we know a lot about the participants' disease and their background. And there's a tracker which enables us to capture prospectively information about things like work-life productivity, about interactions with healthcare systems, so visits to healthcare professionals, hospitalizations. And then, there's a whole load of PROs, so very granular information about various aspects of broadly burden of disease. So I won't read through that long list of PROs, but there's some interesting methodology about how we get to those lists of PROs, not just which of the instruments we choose, but how frequently they should be administered. And these types of studies offer more opportunities to administer questionnaires, PROs, non-PROs, than traditional observational studies, which are perhaps linked only to where you have the opportunity only linked to a site visit. And this is a very simple timeline of the study. So began really early 2020. Phased launches across different countries that you see there. And whole pre-launch, there was a whole series of sort of workshops with patient advocacy groups, key opinion leaders to finalize the design. And then beyond the launch of those countries, there's interim analyses, and then there's publications that begin. There's also governance is extremely important for these studies. There's a scientific advisory board that was convened, bringing a clinical key opinion leader and a patient advocacy group for each of the scope countries. They meet 6 monthly, as you can see here, offering advice about publications, about how the study design might be evolved, and of course, particularly for the patient advocacy groups, providing the perspective of the patients as well, and caregivers. So we're here to talk really about the collaborative elements of these types of studies. So one aspect of that is about publication development. So you see that the graphic on the right, but the patient advocacy groups, the key opinion leaders, and the sponsors are all involved in the development of publications. There's a dedicated publications committee within the scientific advisory board that we in our team coordinate. But the committee contributes to the reviews, approves the publication plan, and then the SAB members are invited to be co-authors for the study publications. So as you can see in this final slide, publications have begun. We've got posters. We've had a manuscript in the BMJ open earlier this year, and you can click through to the to review that. And there's plenty more publications planned for 2022 and beyond. So really rich publications output opportunities. And that's pretty much it. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Intentionally, we didn't want to speak for too long. I wanted to give you a flavour of this type of work, and then really put it back to you for your questions. Hopefully we can answer. Anna, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That was great. I'd like to actually, before we jump into the questions, if Catherine, you could give a little bit of an introduction to yourself, because I've got a question I think is actually for you, but give a bit of context of what you do and what you work in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anna. So, hi everyone. I'm Catherine Bottomley. I'm Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes here at Vitaccess. I've been with the company for almost 2 years now. My background is a PhD pharmacist. I've got 10 years experience working in various pharmaceutical consultancy settings in patient-centered outcome roles. My responsibility here at Vitaccess is to make sure that the data that we're collecting from patients and caregivers is reflective of the issues that are most important to them. And as you can imagine, a lot of that comes up front in the design of these types of registries. So that's me.
Fantastic. I've got a question for you then. So there's a lot of noise about real world evidence studies, but can you give some examples of the type of studies this could mean?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. I think most people on the webinar today will know that real world evidence is a real sort of buzzword at the moment in the industry. Essentially, what real world evidence means is any study outside the constraints of a clinical trial setting. So usually these types of studies either look at how a drug or a particular intervention works in the real world, or they explore the burden of disease in a real world setting. So instead of putting constraints around the participants as you would in a clinical trial, real world evidence studies look at the patients who are actually sitting in front of those prescribing clinicians. So a couple of examples of patients that might be included in a real world study, but not necessarily included in a clinical trial, might be those who are elderly or those with multiple comorbidities. In terms of what those studies actually look like, in designing a real world study, what type of methodologies would we use? There really is huge variation in the same way that there are for clinical trials. So these could vary from the long-term registries, the type of studies that Mark described earlier, to shorter sort of gap-filling, more focused studies, answering very specific research questions. And they can vary hugely in scope. We undertake studies sometimes in just one country, one geographical location, and we also undertake global studies in multiple countries. These can be very short in terms of timelines, very quick, sort of snappy studies, or they can be very long. We can collect data over many months or many years from patients. Mark's already mentioned various types of recruitment that can vary from clinical site recruitment that we would typically see in clinical trials through to more creative methods of recruitment, for example, going through patient associations. And I guess the really important thing in these real world studies is to be able to tailor that design to the research questions that you have in mind. So pharmaceutical clients will often come to us with particular research questions, and it's up to us to have those discussions with them to design that study to address those questions, but also to start to think about the audience for that data up front. So who's actually going to be looking at the data that falls out of this study? Is it going to be HTA bodies, regulators? Are we aiming for that data to be published in the scientific literature? And the answer to that question will often inform what that study is going to look like.
Well, actually, that brings me to thinking about methodologies and strategies as well for in the actual PRO. But I'll come back to another question for you in a minute, Catherine. There's one for Casey. What type of data can be gathered from a rare disease registry, and how can that data be used?
So the best way to think about the data that can be captured is kind of an array. So if you think vertically, which is not great, but you have options that are, our studies, so an app, participant reported data, but then you also have data that can be captured in the same way with and without the input of a HCP, or in the same way with and without the input of a caregiver, as we often have with children. You can also then have site-based data that could be inputted by a researcher or a clinician, or we have dual-entered data where a participant does everything that they would ordinarily do. In parallel, we could set up a website, much simpler for their clinician to confirm HbA1c levels, for example. And this can be because there's, for some diseases, for some ages, cognitive abilities, but also in some countries, if part of the purpose of these are to engage with payers, payers are very hesitant about signing contracts based on outcomes that only come from patients. So you need that additional layer. And then there's linkage with historical controls. So everything can sort of go down that list. And then the other dimension is very similar. If people are familiar with clinical trials, in this meeting, when you think about flat files from, say, ATOM data sets, we work very similarly. We work on like a survey basis. So people join the registry, they're onboarded, they fill out demographics, disease information, treatment information, what have you, treatment history. Then they may move on to PROs. We can ask a lot. We can ask them at any type of cadence because of access patients have to the device. And then other questionnaires that are bespoke. So all of our registries have bespoke questions that may be things that a client wants to have overlap between our study and something else that they've been doing. Do you want the same question? Or just things that aren't already in a PRO that they really want information on. It could be a flare-based disease and you want to capture flares and exacerbations in a particular way, for example. So that can go across the top. And the reason why it's an array is because you get different things from different places. And I think that tracks to your second question about how these data can be used. If again, you think from a development perspective, if you think about it from a development perspective, not in terms of the drug, but in terms of the information, you don't really generate information, certainly not pre-phase 1, but from phase 1, you could be generating information to design phase 2, and from phase 2 to phase 3, but from phase 2, you're publishing. If it's a rare enough disease or cell and gene therapy, you may be trying to launch and get regulatory approval from phase 2, but you're generating clinical evidence. Depending on the developer and the manufacturer, and this varies widely, my background is HEOR, I've also produced things like cost effectiveness models or budget impact analyses at all of those different stages for the same purpose, to help our clients understand where the gaps are, what should go into a clinical trial. If I identify gaps in phase 2, it can tell them while you are running your phase 3 study, you need to run these 2 other studies so that when you get to the end and you go to NICE, you have everything. You don't get 3 months from NICE and then discover you have a gap. Ours work the same, our registries work the same way, and it can depend on the strategic objectives, it can be the patient population size, it can be how the budgets within our clients work for different stages of development. But it's a salient point because one, where you start in that process and why you start in that process directly dictates what you would create from our registry, from that array. Like there's just a direct map. But because our registries are modular, you could start in phase 1 with actually some pretty basic stuff to help you figure out your target patient population and set up your phase 2. But when your phase 2 is running, you could bring into that more countries, but also PROs. You could start to understand what PROs are and are not working in the patient population and bring those into your phase 3 study and so forth. So it's everything everywhere, but the answer is mostly that long-winded because I'm an economist, but also because the registries are as modular as they are. It's not quite like a clinical trial where a phase 2 typically is this amount of size capturing this amount of stuff. So it goes in this space. There's just a lot of flexibility because it's highly modular, that it can be in all these different places, or it can expand and shrink through these different periods.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing maybe, Casey, which to build on that, which is, as you said, really it's designing a study like this is a different mindset from clinical trials because there's lots more flexibility. You talked about different things at different times, but even if a sponsor might have a really good idea of what design they want to do, it might be 8 countries and these are exactly the data we want for these audiences. Nonetheless, it is still worth doing a pilot. What is the pilot? What does the pilot look like? Do that and learn because we can, and it's crazy not to.
I'm going to take us back a bit to the presentation you were talking about, Mark, as well, when we talk about the co-creation of the registries with patient advocacy groups and key opinion leaders. and how really that is at the core of the successful study design. And this might be a question for anyone to pick up, but how has working with key opinion leaders and patient advocacy group representatives helped with designing rare registries? And I don't know if that's one for you, Mark, or for Catherine.
Well, I mean, perhaps I could just say a very short answer, then I think Catherine's got some great experience in this. But broadly, I mean, in the studies that we've done, the opportunities to interact with those different stakeholders and gain input from them in the design, but then also in the implementation phases when we're reviewing data, has been absolutely invaluable. So we would not have done the same studies or designed the same studies had we not garnered that feedback from those groups. And it does take time, and but it's when you do it, we've never done a study for which that has not been valuable. But Catherine, do you want to talk a little bit about the methodology, because it does create some complexity actually of how we, because there's lots of different ways one can do things. Just thinking about PRO strategy, I mean, there's so many different possibilities, and input from different stakeholders is valuable. How do we structure that?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Mark. So when we're thinking about the involvement of the patient advocacy groups and the clinical experts from a patient-centered outcome point of view, the sort of really key important role that they play is for helping us to understand what it's like to live with a particular condition. So when we first start to think about the planning of a registry type study, part of my job and those within my team is to understand what it's like to be one of these patients. What's it like to live on a day-to-day basis with this particular condition? What are the particular issues that are important to that group of patients and to those around them, their family, carers, for example? What's the variety of treatment like for that patient, and what's the patient experience in taking these different types of treatment? And although we always start with a literature review, we look for qualitative evidence that's already been published, nothing really beats speaking to real patients. And that's often in the form of patient advocacy group representatives. We would usually do this through one-on-one interviews. Obviously, that's changed a little bit recently with COVID restrictions. So we've adapted to using web-based interviews, which can work really, really well. It's nice to be able to sort of see people on the camera and build a rapport. But essentially, it helps us to understand those key issues. And then from there, we can look at how best to measure those issues. So we would typically look at available patient-reported outcome measures for that particular condition. And as well as looking at how they've been developed and validated, we would take a really close look at the content of those and the information that's been provided by those patients or by those caregivers. We map onto the content of those questionnaires or instruments, and it helps us to determine which are the best questionnaires to put forward into our webinar or into our study. So that's really, really important to us from a sort of conceptual point of view. Typically thinking about some of the registries that we've worked on recently, when we're holding these type of interviews or sessions with patients, they've also given us other bits of information that we weren't necessarily expecting. So it could be things like asking them to have a look at a short list of patient-reported outcome instruments and to provide their feedback. And they might tell us things like, that these questions are worded very well in this particular instrument, but actually this key symptom that really bothers me, and I know bothers some of my peers, is missing, it's not included. It's really, really important to us. So that type of data really is invaluable in designing these studies. There are other ways that we work with our patient advocacy groups. We work with them throughout the study first of all in recruitment, so actually getting caregivers on board to take part in our studies. We work with them to make sure that we're presenting the data back to the participants in our studies in ways that are digestible, user-friendly, giving people snippets of information and data that are coming out of the study as we go. So the relationship really is there from the start when we're designing the study right through to the end. publication planning and dissemination. We often have patient or patient advocacy group co-authors who are there to help us to steer those publications in the right way and make sure that we're packaging up that data correctly. Not just for scientific publication, but of course for disseminating and sharing that information back to that patient group, whether that's through websites, newsletters, etc.
Yeah. That is very valid. I think I've just added into that about the patients actually getting something out of it themselves and being able to see the data. It's been quite a common feedback from the patients to be kind of actively participating in the study.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a real common motivator. We hear that a lot from patients who've taken part in our study. You know, some of the studies that we run collect data over months and years, and you know, you think, how do you retain patients throughout that study period? And a lot of it is about making sure that we're asking them sensible questions, things that are relatable, valid, important to them, but also making sure that we're letting them know how the study is going. So sharing pieces of information, pieces of data with them.
Yeah, completely. I'm going to read out this question. Hopefully we'll have a little minute to answer this one. It's how does health literacy or lack thereof impact the design of the registry and data collection? And it's followed by 2 other questions as well. So is this where patient groups would play a major role? And now that digital health is the hot topic, how will more rural subjects be involved if digital health is non-existent?
What was the last one?
Casey.
You faded out.
The last one is how will more rural subjects be involved if digital health is non-existent?
It's an excellent question, especially in the US, where broadband and cellular signals in rural areas is its own question. But we have a big infrastructure bill here. So the first part with health literacy, it is super interesting, and Catherine could probably talk a bit about this after me. You know, when I was saying earlier about how we have PROs and then bespoke questions, PROs by and large are validated. They've been through a lot of steps, one would hope, so that they are accessible, like it's accessible English or whatever the language is, and that the questions are well formed. And so have you bespoke questions, completely different story. And every registry I've been on has had it's collaborative, very significantly collaborative. B, it's always been at least a negotiation between, say, my team or maybe Catherine and me about, okay, you have this question because you want this data, you want this piece of information. I can tell you from my perspective as an expert that if you phrase it this way, you are likely to get a thing that will not, like, I can't create this piece of information from the answer to this question. I can create this piece of information from these pieces of data, and you can get those from these questions. And from our client's perspective, it can go both ways. They may want something simpler because they know their patients better than I do. They may want something more complicated because they've got a lot more creativity and higher ambitions that we have to pull in a little bit. And then in the middle of that, I think Mark had talked about piloting. You know, this is where patient advocacy groups do come in. This is where pilot projects do come in. One of the soft advantages of a study like ours, of our registry, there are certainly 2. One is that it produces data constantly. And so one of the things that we monitor, certainly as the registry is getting started, is like who's joining, but also what are they answering? Like, can they answer this question, or is it just always missing? Are they answering it, but we're getting back something that looks like junk? And okay, how do we turn this around? Can we rephrase the question? Can we have our development team just go back and change the phrasing? The other is, because of the nature of it being an app, I'm not going to wave my phone around again, that in and of itself can be changed. So if you think about a legacy study where a research nurse may fill out a CRF and ask people questions, we can actually face the participant directly, and we can change what we tell them. So we can give them a prompt in front of any given question to explain ourselves if we have to. And if that appears not to work, we can change what that prompt is. We don't play around month by month, but we have the ability to spot whether a question doesn't seem to be connecting and then regroup and then fix it. So we lose, ideally, very, very little data over this because we can spot the problem. That's the patient advocacy group angle, and we also use those, I think Mark said, very heavily for recruitment and for community outreach. That's not severable. In order, like it's somewhere between a quid pro quo and sine qua non. If a patient advocacy group is going to work with us on our behalf to get their patients in, they are going to have some oversight of what we're going to ask their patients. They always go together, and it's highly valuable. Rural, yeah, hopefully. I mean, it's a real mix. You know, there are some elements which the question might be getting at, like health literacy is not a neutral thing in the population based on education, income, location, race, what have you. Merely by doing this in a digital format, we have accessibility questions that we always have to treat on a case-by-case basis, often around age and frailty, or how an illness may affect somebody's dexterity, for example. We haven't yet, I don't think, Mark or Catherine may know, had directly to confront an issue such as rurality, in the sense that does the patient population that we are targeting tend to live in a rural, underserved area based on infrastructure? And if that were the case, we would actually have to figure something out, I think. Catherine, did everything I say about bespoke questions?
Yeah,
sound
absolutely,
right?
Casey. I don't have a huge amount to add other than just to emphasize what you said about testing. So in all of our registries and all of our studies, we would always conduct testing up front. So whether that was cognitive testing, making sure that people are actually understanding the questions that we're asking them and able to give their answers in the way that they want to, giving us the right pieces of data, right pieces of information, through also to user testing as well. So often, probably less so, you know, the last couple of years, but when we say we do digital studies, the response that we've sometimes got back is, well, what about those who don't use iPads, don't use phones? What about those who just like the good old-fashioned paper? And so as well as cognitive testing, usability testing and user testing for actually inputting data on these devices is really, really important. And we typically use a combination of those two types of testing up front, making those changes as we go before we actually go live with it, with any study.
And there's just very quickly, there's an interesting, I mean, these types of studies aren't the universal panacea to be able to address and engage engagement disparities. We always have to think about biases, and it's a bit like telemedicine, right? There's broadly that opens up a range of opportunities that weren't there before telemedicine, but there are some considerations as to access to telemedicine for different types of subgroups and patients.
Great. Right, now it is time, so we won't have a chance to finish all the questions, but we'll get back in touch with the answers to those, and hopefully the answers we gave today were satisfactory. Just follow us up if you need to know any more. Thank you so much, Mark, Catherine and Casey, and we look forward to seeing you all in the new year for the next webinar series. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks, Bye.